Welcome, sleepy soul. Tonight, drift back into the candlelit corridors of history's most legendary library, the Library of Alexandria, a sanctuary of scrolls, wisdom, and wonder, where the air once hummed with the thoughts of Plato, the star maps of ancient astronomers, and the whispered debates of scholars who dreamed of cataloguing all human knowledge. What was it truly like to walk those endless marble halls? What secrets were lost in its fabled flames? And did it ever really burn the way we've been told? Tonight, let the silence of forgotten papyrus lull you to sleep as we trace the rise and the quiet disappearance of history's most mysterious temple of learning. Before we open the ancient gates and step into this soft echo of the past, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tap the bell icon for more sleepy stories from long ago. Tell us in the comments, what book would you have placed in the Library of Alexandria if you had the chance? Your answers guide the stories we tell next. Imagine walking through the bustling streets of Alexandria in the year 306 BCE. When the Mediterranean air carried not just the scent of salt and commerce, but the intoxicating promise of universal knowledge. You would have seen construction workers hauling massive limestone blocks, their sweat mixing with the dust of what would become the most ambitious intellectual project the ancient world had ever witnessed. This was no ordinary building project. It was the physical manifestation of an impossible dream: to collect every written work in existence and house it in one place, available to the greatest minds of the age. The man behind this audacious vision was Ptolemy Soter, formerly one of Alexander the Great's most trusted generals, who had carved out Egypt as his personal kingdom following Alexander's death. Ptolemy was not content with merely ruling a wealthy kingdom. He sought to create something eternal, something that would outlast his dynasty and cement his legacy in the marble and papyrus of history. But, like many great undertakings, the idea did not originate with him alone. It came from an unlikely source, a dejected Athenian politician named Demetrius of Phalerum, who arrived in Alexandria as an exile. His political career in ruins, but his intellectual ambitions burning brighter than ever. Demetrius had once governed Athens under Macedonian supervision, implementing moderate reforms that pleased neither the democratic faction nor the aristocratic elite. When the political winds shifted, he found himself persona non grata in his own city, forced to seek refuge in the court of Ptolemy, who welcomed scholars the way other kings welcomed gold. You can picture Demetrius, perhaps in his 50s, his beard streaked with grey, his eyes still sharp with the intelligence that had once made him one of Athens's most respected statesmen. He carried with him not just his personal library, but something far more valuable, a vision of what a library could become if given royal patronage and unlimited resources. The conversations between Ptolemy and Demetrius must have been fascinating to witness. Picture them in the palace courtyards, surrounded by fountains and gardens, discussing the nature of knowledge while servants brought them wine, cooled with snow brought from the mountains. Demetrius would have spoken passionately about Aristotle's Lyceum, where he had studied, explaining how knowledge flourished when scholars were freed from mundane concerns. He proposed something unprecedented. Not just a repository of books, but a research institution where the greatest minds of the age could live, work, and teach, supported entirely by royal funds. The library would be the heart of this institution, but only one part of a larger complex dedicated to the muses, the goddesses of inspiration in literature, science, and the arts. Ptolemy, who had inherited both Alexander's ambition and his respect for Greek culture, listened intently. Here was a project worthy of his new capital, a city that would bear Alexander's name forever. Alexandria was already becoming the greatest port in the Mediterranean, strategically positioned at the crossroads of trade routes connecting Europe, Asia, and Africa. Ships from every corner of the known world brought goods, people, and ideas to its harbors. What better place to create a center of learning that would draw scholars from every nation? But the practical challenges were enormous. How do you collect every book in existence when most works exist only in a handful of copies scattered across the Mediterranean? How do you organize such a collection so that scholars can actually find what they're looking for? How do you preserve papyrus scrolls in Egypt's harsh climate, where insects devour organic material and the dry air makes papyrus brittle? These were the questions that kept Demetrius awake at night, pacing in his quarters as he worked out the organizational structure of what would become known as the Mausion. The name itself was significant. Demetrius deliberately chose to call it a shrine to the Muses rather than simply a library, elevating it from a storage facility to a sacred space where knowledge was worshipped. This was clever politics as well as poetic thinking. By framing the project as a religious undertaking, Ptolemy could justify the enormous expense as an act of piety rather than mere intellectual indulgence. The priests of the traditional Egyptian temples had to be placated as they controlled much of the country's wealth and influence. Presenting the Mausion as complementing rather than competing with their religious authority was essential. Construction began around 306 BCE, though the exact timeline remains uncertain. You would have seen an army of workers, Egyptian laborers who had spent generations building pyramids and temples, Greek architects who understood the principles of symmetry and proportion, and skilled craftsmen from across the Mediterranean. The site chosen was in the royal quarter of Alexandria, the Brucheion, where the Ptolemaic palace complex sprawled along the waterfront. This was no accident. By placing the Mausion within the royal grounds, Ptolemy ensured that access could be controlled and that the scholars would be under royal protection. The architectural design reflected both Greek and Egyptian influences, a fitting symbol for a project that sought to synthesize all human knowledge. Massive limestone blocks, some weighing several tons, were quarried and transported to the site. Greek columns with their distinctive capitals, Doric for strength, Ionic for elegance, Corinthian for luxury, created colonnades where scholars could walk and discuss ideas, just as Aristotle had done in his Lyceum. Egyptian elements included the careful orientation of buildings according to astronomical principles, a practice dating back to the construction of the pyramids. But while the physical structure rose from the ground, Demetrius faced an even more daunting challenge: how to actually collect the books. In the ancient world, there was no publishing industry as we understand it today. Most texts existed in just a few copies, often poorly copied and full of errors. Works by famous authors like Homer might exist in dozens of versions, each slightly different from the others. New works by contemporary authors were even rarer, often existing only as the author's original manuscript or a single copy made by a scribe. Demetrius devised a systematic approach that would have impressed even modern librarians. First, he sent agents to every major city in the Greek world with instructions to purchase any books they could find, regardless of subject matter or quality. These agents carried letters of introduction from Ptolemy himself, ensuring they received cooperation from local officials. They were given virtually unlimited funds, as Ptolemy understood that the reputation of his library would depend on the comprehensiveness of its collection. Second, Demetrius established what might be called the ancient world's first systematic confiscation policy. Any ship entering Alexandria's harbor was subject to inspection. If books were found aboard, they were immediately seized and taken to the Mausion, where scribes made copies. The copies were returned to the ship's owners, while the originals, presumably more accurate and valuable, were kept for the library. This practice was so systematic that it became one of Alexandria's defining characteristics, mentioned by travelers and merchants throughout the Mediterranean. The third method was perhaps the most ingenious, borrowing important manuscripts under false pretenses and never returning them. The most famous example involved the original manuscripts of the three great Athenian tragedians, Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. These were kept in Athens as national treasures. But Ptolemy III, continuing his grandfather's policies, managed to borrow them by posting a bond of 15 talents, an astronomical sum equivalent to several $1 million in today's currency. Once the manuscripts were in Alexandria, they were carefully copied onto the finest papyrus, and the copies were sent back to Athens along with a polite note explaining that Ptolemy had decided to keep the originals and forfeit the bond. This incident became legendary, establishing Alexandria's reputation as a place where the pursuit of knowledge knew no ethical bounds. By the time Demetrius died, probably around 283 BCE, the basic structure of the Library of Alexandria was in place. The collection was growing daily. Scholars from across the Greek world were applying for positions at the Mouseion, and Ptolemy III's successors were committed to continuing the project. But the true test of the library's significance would come not from its founding, but from its daily operations. How would this unprecedented institution actually function? What would a typical day look like for the scholars who lived and worked there? And how would the library's existence change not just Alexandria, but the entire ancient world? As you drift off to sleep, consider this. Every great undertaking begins with a vision, but vision alone is never enough. The Library of Alexandria succeeded because it combined audacious ambition with meticulous planning, royal patronage with scholarly dedication, and practical organization with philosophical idealism. Yet even the best-laid plans must adapt to changing circumstances, and the library's story is as much about adaptation and survival as it is about collection and preservation. What would happen when political realities shifted, when funding became scarce, when the very idea of universal knowledge seemed increasingly impossible to maintain? The next chapter of our story begins not with grand visions, but with the daily rhythms of life inside this remarkable institution, where the mundane tasks of copying, cataloging, and teaching became the foundation for intellectual achievements that would echo through the centuries. But first, you might wonder, how exactly did they organize hundreds of thousands of scrolls in an age before card catalogs or computer databases? Imagine waking up in the pre-dawn darkness of Alexandria, the Mediterranean breeze carrying the mingled scents of sea salt, incense from nearby temples, and the faint but persistent aroma of papyrus paste that seemed to permeate every corner of the Mouseion complex. You would be one of perhaps 50 scholars fortunate enough to have been granted residence in this remarkable institution, where the pursuit of knowledge had been elevated to something approaching divine worship. Your quarters, while not luxurious by royal standards, would have been more comfortable than most accommodations available to intellectuals in the ancient world. Stone walls to keep out the heat, a small window overlooking the central gardens, and most remarkably, a wooden writing desk with ink pots and reed pens provided at royal expense. The Mouseion was not a single building, but a sprawling complex that covered several acres within Alexandria's royal quarter. 10 massive halls, each dedicated to housing different categories of knowledge, formed the heart of the library. These were not simple storage rooms, but architectural marvels in their own right. The walls were lined with rectangular niches called bibliothecae, where papyrus scrolls were stored horizontally in protective cylinders made from leather or ceramic. Each niche was carefully labeled with small bronze tablets, pinnaces they were called, that identified the contents using the revolutionary cataloging system developed by Callimachus. The halls were connected by marble colonnades where scholars could walk in shade while discussing philosophy, mathematics, or the latest astronomical observations. Climate control in the ancient world presented constant challenges, particularly in Egypt, where the dry air could make papyrus brittle and the occasional humidity could encourage mold growth. The architects of the Mouseion had devised clever solutions. The main reading rooms faced north, taking advantage of Alexandria's prevailing winds to create natural ventilation. High windows with wooden shutters could be adjusted throughout the day to control light and temperature. During the hottest months, servants would sprinkle water on the floors to cool the air through evaporation. A primitive but effective form of air conditioning that must have been welcome relief from the Egyptian sun. Your morning would begin with the sound of a bronze gong struck by temple servants, echoing through the colonnades at first light. The scholars would gather in the massive circular dining hall, its domed ceiling painted with constellations and mythological scenes. Breakfast was simple but substantial. Bread baked that morning in the complex's ovens, honey from the royal apiaries, and watered wine. The conversation would range from the mundane complaints about the quality of the ink to heated debates about the proper pronunciation of Homeric Greek. You might find yourself sitting next to Eratosthenes, who would later calculate the Earth's circumference with remarkable accuracy, or across from Aristophanes of Byzantium, whose encyclopedic memory allowed him to recite entire plays from memory. After breakfast, the real work of the day began. If you were a scribe, and the Mousion employed dozens of them, you would head to the scriptorium, a long hall lined with writing desks where the constant scratch of reed pens on papyrus created a rhythmic background noise that became almost meditative. The primary task was copying texts, both for preservation and for creating new copies to send back to the original owners whose books had been confiscated from ships. This was not merely mechanical transcription but careful scholarly work. Scribes were expected to compare multiple manuscripts of the same text, noting variations in the margins and making educated decisions about which reading was most likely correct. The quality of papyrus available to the library's scribes was exceptional, produced in the Nile Delta where the climate and water conditions created ideal growing conditions for the cypress papyrus plant. The manufacturing process was complex and closely guarded by Egyptian craftsmen. The plant's fibrous stems were sliced into thin strips, laid in overlapping layers, and pressed together while still damp. The natural plant sugars acted as an adhesive, creating a smooth writing surface when dried and polished. The resulting sheets were then glued together edge to edge to create scrolls that could extend for 20 or 30 feet. The library's scribes used only the finest quality papyrus, designated hieratic grade, which had been processed multiple times to achieve an almost parchment-like smoothness. If you were a scholar rather than a scribe, your morning might be spent in the observatory, a specialized building with a domed roof that could be rotated to reveal different sections of the sky. Here, astronomers tracked the movements of planets and stars, refining calculations that would eventually allow sailors to navigate by the stars and farmers to predict the Nile's annual flooding. The instruments were crude by modern standards: brass astrolabes, water clocks for measuring time, and sighting tubes, but the observations were systematic and meticulously recorded on clay tablets that could survive Egypt's climate better than papyrus. The library's collection was organized according to Callimachus's revolutionary Pinakes system, which divided knowledge into major categories and then further subdivided them into increasingly specific topics. The philosophy section, for example, was arranged chronologically by the birth dates of philosophers, with separate sections for different schools of thought. Each scroll's entry in the catalogue included not just its title and author, but extensive biographical information about the writer, a summary of the work's contents, its length in lines, and even notes about textual authenticity and previous ownership. This was the world's first systematic attempt to create what we would recognize as a modern library catalogue, and its influence on library science continues to this day. Lunch was taken communally in the dining hall, with scholars sitting according to their specialties, poets with poets, mathematicians with mathematicians, though conversation often crossed disciplinary boundaries. The food was simple but plentiful, funded by royal revenues that also supported the scholars' modest salaries. After the meal, there might be a formal lecture or debate, with visiting scholars presenting their latest research. These sessions could become quite heated, particularly when they touched on controversial topics like the nature of the divine or the proper methods for interpreting Homer's epics. The afternoon hours were the most productive for serious scholarship. The heat outside made the library's cool interior even more attractive, and the combination of natural light from the high windows and oil lamps provided adequate illumination for reading. If you were working on a particularly important or fragile manuscript, you might request access to the special collections room, where the most valuable scrolls were kept in climate-controlled conditions. These included original works by famous authors, very old copies of important texts, and books that had been acquired through particularly challenging or expensive means. The physical handling of scrolls required considerable skill and care. A typical papyrus scroll was about 9 to 10 inches high and could extend for 30 feet or more. Reading required unrolling the scroll with one hand while rolling it up with the other, a process that had to be done slowly to prevent tearing the delicate papyrus. The ink used for writing was a mixture of soot, gum arabic, and water, which created a durable black pigment that has survived for over 2 millennia in Egypt's dry climate. Marginal notes and corrections were often made in red ink, creating a visual system that allowed readers to distinguish between the original text and scholarly annotations. Evening brought a change in atmosphere. As the sun set over the Mediterranean, oil lamps were lit throughout the complex, creating pools of warm light in the gathering darkness. The gardens became a favored place for evening strolls where scholars could continue their discussions while enjoying the cool air. The sound of fountains and the scent of exotic plants, some brought from as far away as India, created an almost otherworldly atmosphere. It was during these evening hours that some of the most important intellectual exchanges occurred, as scholars relaxed their formal guard and shared ideas more freely. But life in the Mausoleum was not all scholarly pursuits and intellectual discourse. The institution was part of the royal court, and politics inevitably intruded. Scholars were expected to produce work that reflected well on the Ptolemaic dynasty, and certain topics were effectively off-limits. Criticism of the ruling family, discussion of Egyptian independence movements, or questions about the legitimacy of Greek rule in Egypt could result in the loss of one's position, or worse. You had to navigate these restrictions carefully, finding ways to pursue truth within the boundaries of what was politically acceptable. The social hierarchy within the Mausoleum was complex and often strained. At the top were the celebrity scholars like Eratosthenes or Aristarchus of Samothrace, whose work had brought them international recognition. They enjoyed larger quarters, better food, and more comfortable salaries. Below them were the ordinary scholars who had proven their worth through published work or teaching ability. At the bottom were the scribes and support staff, who, despite their essential role in maintaining the library's operations, were rarely acknowledged in the historical records. Yet even within these categories, there were subtle gradations based on age, reputation, and political connections. As night settled over Alexandria, most scholars would retire to their quarters to continue reading or writing by lamplight. The library never truly closed. Scrolls could be requested at any hour, and the halls were patrolled by guards who doubled as librarians' assistants. The sound of the Mediterranean waves against the shore provided a constant background rhythm, occasionally punctuated by the calls of night birds or the distant sounds of the city beyond the palace walls. The remarkable aspect of daily life in the Mausoleum was how it combined the sacred and the practical, the philosophical and the mundane. Here, in this complex of buildings dedicated to the Muses, some of humanity's greatest intellectual achievements were produced through the patient accumulation of small, daily efforts. Each copied scroll, each catalogue entry, each measured astronomical observation contributed to a body of knowledge that would influence civilization for centuries to come. Yet even as this intellectual paradise functioned day by day, forces were gathering that would eventually bring about its decline. The political stability that made such an institution possible was beginning to erode, and the very success of the library's collecting mission was creating new challenges. How long could the royal treasury support such an expensive undertaking? What would happen when the supply of available texts began to dwindle? And how would the scholars adapt to a world where their particular brand of learning was becoming less valued? As you prepare for sleep, consider how the mundane details of daily life, what time breakfast was served, how scrolls were handled, where scholars sat during lectures, become the foundation for historical change. The Library of Alexandria was not just a collection of books or a gathering of brilliant minds. It was a living institution whose daily rhythms created the conditions for intellectual breakthroughs that still resonate today. But what would happen when those rhythms were disrupted, when the careful balance between royal patronage and scholarly independence could no longer be maintained? The story continues not with the famous destruction you might have heard about, but with something more subtle and perhaps more significant: the gradual transformation of an intellectual community and the challenges of maintaining universal knowledge in an increasingly complex world. Picture yourself as a book collector for the Library of Alexandria in the year 250 BCE, dispatched by royal decree to the farthest corners of the Mediterranean world, with a leather purse heavy with gold coins and instructions that bordered on the impossible. Bring back every written work you can find, regardless of subject matter, language, or condition. Your journey would begin in Alexandria's great harbour, where hundreds of ships from dozens of ports jostled for space at the stone quays, their holds filled with grain, wine, pottery, and occasionally the precious cargo that justified your expedition. The methods developed by the Ptolemaic dynasty for acquiring books were as systematic as they were ruthless. You would not be working alone. The Ptolemies maintained a permanent network of book buyers stationed in every major port and intellectual center of the ancient world. In Athens, your colleague might be negotiating with the heirs of a deceased philosopher's estate, offering prices that seemed extravagant for what appeared to be bundles of dried papyrus. In Rhodes, another agent would be combing the bustling book markets that had made that island famous as a center of intellectual commerce. In the Black Sea port of Sinop, yet another collector would be boarding merchant vessels to search their cargo for any written materials, sometimes finding navigational charts that contained geographic knowledge, unknown to Greek scholars. The most famous and infamous method of acquisition involved the systematic inspection of every ship entering Alexandria's harbor. As you approached the city after months of travel, having filled several chests with manuscripts acquired through purchase, trade, or sometimes outright theft, you would witness this process in action. The harbor police, equipped with royal authority that overrode normal commercial protections, would board each vessel and conduct thorough searches. Any books or written materials discovered were immediately seized and taken to the library, where scribes would make copies while the originals were retained for the royal collection. The ship's owner would receive the copies along with what the Ptolemies considered adequate compensation, though the definition of adequate was flexible and often left the seafaring merchants feeling cheated. This practice became so notorious that it established Alexandria's reputation throughout the Mediterranean as a place where knowledge was valued above commercial rights. Merchants began hiding their most valuable books among other cargo, or simply avoiding Alexandria altogether if they carried particularly precious manuscripts. The Ptolemies responded by extending their search net, requiring ships to declare any written materials before entering Egyptian waters and stationing collectors in other major ports to intercept valuable texts before they could be concealed. The system became increasingly complex and expensive, but the dynasty's commitment to universal knowledge collection remained absolute. The international scope of the collecting effort was unprecedented in human history. Your travels would take you to places where Greek was barely spoken, where your Egyptian gold coins might buy not just books, but local guides who could help you navigate unfamiliar customs and languages. In Jerusalem, you might acquire Hebrew scriptures that would later be translated into Greek as the Septuagint, creating one of the most influential texts in Western civilization. In Persia, you could find astronomical texts written in cuneiform that contained observations centuries older than any Greek records. In India, mathematical treatises used numeral systems that seemed primitive but contained concepts that would revolutionize Greek mathematics. The Ptolemy's agents were instructed to prioritize older manuscripts over newer copies, based on the reasonable assumption that texts copied fewer times were more likely to be accurate. This preference for antiquity created a fascinating paradox. The library became simultaneously the most comprehensive collection of human knowledge and a repository of some of the most fragile and deteriorated texts in existence. You would often find yourself purchasing manuscripts that were already centuries old, their papyrus beginning to crumble, their ink fading to illegibility in places. These acquisitions required immediate attention from the library's preservation specialists, who had developed techniques for stabilizing deteriorating papyrus using natural resins and protective coatings. The financial commitment required for this international collecting effort was staggering. Contemporary accounts suggest that the Ptolemies spent more on book acquisition than on any other single royal project except military campaigns. You would carry enough gold to purchase entire estates, enough to tempt even the most reluctant book owners to part with their most precious possessions. The agents sent to Athens to borrow the original manuscripts of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides deposited 15 talents of silver, equivalent to several $1 million in modern currency, as surety for their return. When the Ptolemies decided to keep the originals and forfeit this enormous sum, they sent a clear message about their priorities. Knowledge, particularly knowledge that could not be easily replaced, was worth any price. But the collecting effort was not merely about accumulation. The Ptolemies understood that a universal library required more than just storage space. It needed systems for organization, preservation, and access. Every text you acquired would be catalogued according to the Pinakes system, translated into Greek if necessary, and subjected to scholarly analysis. Multiple versions of the same work were compared side by side, with scholars noting variations and attempting to determine which readings were most authentic. This process of textual criticism, developed in Alexandria's halls, became the foundation for all subsequent philological study. The translation effort alone represented a massive undertaking. You would often acquire texts in languages that had never been systematically translated into Greek, requiring the library to employ specialists in Egyptian, Hebrew, Persian, and other languages. These translators faced the challenge not just of converting words from one language to another, but of bridging entirely different conceptual frameworks. Egyptian medical texts, for example, used concepts of bodily humors and spiritual balances that had no direct Greek equivalents. Persian astronomical observations were recorded using mathematical systems that required extensive scholarly interpretation before they could be integrated into Greek scientific understanding. The geographic reach of the collecting network extended far beyond what might seem practical for a single library. Agents were stationed in Massilia, modern Marseille, on the far western Mediterranean, in the Greek colonies along the Black Sea, and in the trading entrepôts of the Near East. They maintained correspondence with each other, sharing information about new texts that had become available and coordinating their efforts to avoid duplication. This early information network created a prototype for the kind of international scholarly collaboration that would not become common again. Until the modern era, the impact of this collecting effort extended far beyond the library's walls. The systematic acquisition of knowledge from across the known world created a new model for intellectual inquiry. Instead of being limited to local traditions or the works available in one's immediate vicinity, scholars could now access the accumulated wisdom of civilizations that had developed independently for centuries. This cross-cultural fertilization led to breakthroughs in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy that might never have occurred otherwise. Yet even as this international collecting machine reached its zenith, problems were beginning to emerge. The supply of available texts was not infinite, and the most valuable works had already been acquired. The cost of maintaining the collecting network was becoming increasingly burdensome, particularly as the Ptolemaic dynasty faced military challenges and internal political pressures. Agents began reporting that their searches were yielding fewer significant finds, that the book markets of the Mediterranean were becoming depleted of truly valuable material. More importantly, the very success of the library's collecting effort was creating new challenges. With hundreds of thousands of scrolls in its collection, the institution was beginning to strain under the weight of its own comprehensiveness. Scholars found it increasingly difficult to navigate the vast collection, and the cataloguing system, while sophisticated for its time, was struggling to keep pace with the acquisition rate. The library had succeeded in its goal of collecting all human knowledge, but it was discovering that possessing knowledge and making it accessible and useful were two very different challenges. As you prepare for sleep, consider this. The Library of Alexandria's collecting effort represents perhaps the most ambitious intellectual project in human history, a systematic attempt to gather, preserve, and make accessible the entire recorded knowledge of civilization. Its methods were sometimes unscrupulous, its costs were enormous, and its practical challenges were often overwhelming. Yet, it created a model for universal knowledge that continues to influence how we think about libraries, scholarship, and the very nature of intellectual inquiry. The question that remains is whether such a comprehensive approach to knowledge collection remains possible or even desirable in our own age of information overload. What would a modern Library of Alexandria look like, and what methods would it use to collect not just books but the digital information that now constitutes the majority of human knowledge? The story continues with the challenges of maintaining such an institution, the political pressures, the financial strains, and the gradual realization that collecting knowledge is only the beginning of the much more difficult task of preserving and sharing it across generations. But first, you might wonder, how did the scholars who lived and worked in this remarkable institution actually use its vast resources? And what intellectual achievements emerged from their access to this unprecedented collection of human wisdom? Imagine waking before dawn in your modest quarters within the Mauseon complex, the air already warm with the promise of another scorching Alexandrian day. You would hear the gentle splash of fountains in the central courtyard, and the distant calls of merchants setting up their stalls in the city beyond the palace walls. As one of the fortunate scholars granted residence in this remarkable institution, your day would follow a rhythm that had been carefully crafted to maximize intellectual productivity while minimizing the distractions that plagued scholars in less privileged circumstances. The Mauseon operated on a schedule that balanced individual research with collective activities, recognizing that great intellectual breakthroughs often emerged from the intersection of solitary study and collaborative discussion. Your morning would begin with the sound of a bronze bell struck by temple servants, not the harsh clang of a work bell, but a musical tone designed to ease the transition from sleep to wakefulness. The scholars would emerge from their quarters, modest but comfortable rooms arranged around internal courtyards, each equipped with a writing desk, oil lamps, and basic writing materials provided at royal expense. Breakfast was taken communally in the circular dining hall, its domed ceiling painted with constellations that must have seemed wondrous to ancient eyes. The meal itself was simple but substantial. Fresh bread from the complex's ovens, honey from the royal apiaries, cheese from the Nile Delta, and watered wine. But the real nourishment came from the conversation. You might find yourself seated next to Eratosthenes, who would later calculate the Earth's circumference with remarkable accuracy, discussing his current research on the angles of shadows cast by the sun at different latitudes. Or perhaps across from Aristophanes of Byzantium, whose encyclopedic memory allowed him to recite entire plays from memory, and who would good-naturedly correct anyone who misquoted Homer during breakfast conversation. The morning hours were devoted to individual research, and the library's design facilitated this work with remarkable foresight. The 10 main halls, each dedicated to different subject areas, were arranged to take advantage of Alexandria's prevailing winds, creating natural ventilation that kept the interior surprisingly cool even during the height of summer. High windows with wooden shutters could be adjusted throughout the day to control both light and temperature. The walls were lined with rectangular niches, bibliothecae, where papyrus scrolls were stored horizontally in protective cylinders made from leather or glazed ceramic. Each niche was carefully labeled with bronze tablets that identified not just the works contained within, but their relative importance and condition. If your research required consulting multiple texts simultaneously, you could request a special study carrel, a small alcove equipped with multiple scroll holders that allowed you to compare different versions of the same work side by side. This was particularly important for textual criticism, the scholarly discipline that had become one of Alexandria's specialties. You might be working on Homer's epics, comparing versions that had arrived from Chios, Sinope, and Massilia, each containing slight variations that revealed how texts changed as they were copied and recopied across the Greek world. The physical handling of scrolls required considerable skill and training. A typical papyrus scroll was about 9 to 10 inches high and could extend for 30 feet or more when fully unrolled. The process of reading required developing a rhythm, unrolling with one hand while rolling up with the other, never moving too quickly lest the delicate papyrus tear. The ink, made from a mixture of soot, gum arabic, and water, created a durable black pigment that has survived for millennia in Egypt's dry climate. Marginal notes and corrections were often made in red ink, creating a visual system that allowed readers to distinguish between the original text and scholarly annotations. If you were a scribe rather than a scholar, and the Mausian employed dozens of them, your morning would be spent in the scriptorium, a long hall lined with writing desks where the constant scratch of reed pens on papyrus created an almost hypnotic background noise. The quality of papyrus available was exceptional, produced in the Nile Delta, where the climate and water conditions created ideal growing conditions for the cypress papyrus plant. The manufacturing process was complex and closely guarded by Egyptian craftsmen, involving slicing the plant's fibrous stems into thin strips, laying them in overlapping layers, and pressing them together while still damp. The natural plant sugars acted as an adhesive, creating a smooth writing surface when dried and polished with smooth stones or shells. The scribe's work was not merely mechanical copying, but careful scholarly labor. When multiple manuscripts of the same text were available, scribes were expected to compare them, noting variations in the margins and making educated decisions about which readings were most likely correct. This was particularly challenging with Homeric texts, where different regions had developed their own standardized versions. The Alexandrian scribes developed a system of marginal symbols, asterisks, obelisks, and other marks to indicate their confidence in different passages, creating a proto-critical apparatus that influenced textual scholarship for centuries. By mid-morning, the complex would come alive with more specialized activities. In the observatory, a domed building that could be rotated to reveal different sections of the sky, astronomers tracked planetary movements using brass astrolabes and water clocks. Their observations were recorded on clay tablets that could survive Egypt's climate better than papyrus, creating a systematic record of celestial movements that would eventually allow for the prediction of eclipses and planetary positions. The accuracy of these observations, maintained over decades by successive generations of scholars, contributed to breakthroughs in understanding the Earth's relationship to other celestial bodies. The medical school, established as part of the Mausion's comprehensive approach to knowledge, conducted its work in a separate building equipped with facilities for dissection and anatomical study. Here, physicians like Herophilus and Erasistratus made groundbreaking discoveries about human anatomy, including the differentiation between sensory and motor nerves, the identification of the brain as the center of intelligence, and detailed descriptions of the circulatory system. Their work was based not just on theoretical study, but on systematic observation and, controversially, human dissection, practices that would not be repeated in Western medicine for over a millennium. Lunch was taken communally, with scholars sitting according to their specialties, philosophers with philosophers, mathematicians with mathematicians, though conversation often crossed disciplinary boundaries. The food was simple but plentiful, funded by revenues from the royal estates. After the meal, there might be a formal lecture or debate, with visiting scholars presenting their latest research. These sessions could become quite heated, particularly when they touched on controversial topics like the nature of the divine or the proper methods for interpreting ancient texts. The afternoon brought specialized instruction and collaborative research. Younger scholars, many of whom served as assistants to more established figures, would attend classes in mathematics, rhetoric, or medicine. The teaching method was primarily Socratic, with teachers guiding students through carefully constructed questions rather than simply imparting information. This approach reflected the influence of Aristotle's Lyceum, whose educational philosophy had shaped the Mausion's development through the influence of its early directors like Demetrius of Phalerum. If your research required consultation with experts in other fields, the afternoon was the optimal time for such collaboration. A mathematician working on geometric proofs might consult with astronomers about the practical applications of his theories. A physician studying the effects of certain drugs might work with botanists who understood the properties of the plants from which those drugs were derived. This interdisciplinary approach was one of the Mausion's most revolutionary aspects, anticipating by centuries the modern research university's emphasis on cross-departmental collaboration. The library's collection was organized according to the Pinakes system developed by Callimachus, which divided knowledge into major categories and then further subdivided them into increasingly specific topics. The philosophy section, for example, was arranged chronologically by the birth dates of philosophers, with separate sections for different schools of thought. Each scroll's entry in the catalogue included not just its title and author, but extensive biographical information about the writer, a summary of the work's contents, its length in lines, and even notes about textual authenticity and previous ownership. This was the world's first systematic attempt to create what we would recognize as a modern library catalogue. As afternoon gave way to evening, the atmosphere in the Mausion shifted subtly. The formal research activities wound down, replaced by more informal intellectual exchanges. The gardens became a favored place for evening strolls where scholars could continue their discussions while enjoying the cool air. The sound of fountains and the scent of exotic plants, some brought from as far away as India, created an almost otherworldly atmosphere that seemed designed to encourage contemplation and creative thinking. The evening hours were also when the institution's political dimensions became more apparent. The Mausion existed at the pleasure of the Ptolemaic dynasty, and while its scholars enjoyed greater intellectual freedom than most of their contemporaries, they were not immune to political pressures. Sensitive topics, criticism of the ruling family, discussion of Egyptian independence movements, or questions about the legitimacy of Greek rule in Egypt, were effectively off-limits. Scholars learned to navigate these restrictions carefully, finding ways to pursue truth within the boundaries of what was politically acceptable. Despite these limitations, the Mausion's daily operations created an intellectual environment that was unprecedented in its scope and sophistication. The combination of systematic research, collaborative scholarship, and comprehensive collection development produced insights that would influence human understanding for centuries. The work done within its walls, whether it was Eratosthenes calculating the Earth's circumference, Aristarchus determining the heliocentric nature of the solar system, or Aristophanes developing the techniques of textual criticism, represented a pinnacle of ancient intellectual achievement. As night settled over Alexandria and you returned to your quarters, perhaps to continue reading by lamplight, you would be participating in a daily rhythm that had been carefully crafted to support the most ambitious intellectual project the ancient world had ever attempted. The Mausion was not just a collection of books or a gathering of scholars, it was a living institution whose daily operations reflected a sophisticated understanding of how knowledge is created, preserved and transmitted across generations. But even as this remarkable institution functioned day by day, the very success that made it possible was beginning to create challenges that would eventually contribute to its decline. The cost of maintaining such comprehensive support for scholarship was enormous, and the political stability that made it possible was beginning to erode. The question that would face the Mausion in the coming decades was not whether it could continue its current operations, but whether it could adapt to a changing world that might no longer value or support such ambitious intellectual undertakings. As you drift towards sleep, consider how the daily rhythms of intellectual work, the patient copying of manuscripts, the careful comparison of texts, the systematic observation of natural phenomena create the foundation for breakthrough insights that can transform human understanding. The scholars of the Mausion understood that knowledge is not just discovered but constructed through patient, systematic effort. Their daily routines, mundane as they might seem, were the building blocks of intellectual achievements that still influence how we understand the world today. The story continues with the intellectual breakthroughs that emerged from this carefully cultivated environment, and how those achievements both elevated and ultimately challenged the institution that made them possible. But first, you might wonder, what specific discoveries emerged from this unique combination of royal patronage, scholarly dedication, and systematic research? And how did those breakthroughs change not just the ancient world, but the course of human intellectual history? The morning sun filtered through the high windows of the mathematics hall, casting long shadows across the papyrus-strewn tables where Eratosthenes sat working on calculations that would change humanity's understanding of its place in the cosmos. At his side lay several scrolls containing astronomical observations from different latitudes, including detailed records from Siene, modern Aswan, where, he had learned, vertical objects cast no shadow at noon during the summer solstice. This seemingly mundane observation would become the foundation for his calculation of Earth's circumference. The process was methodical and patient, reflecting the Mausion's scholarly philosophy. Eratosthenes knew that at the same moment when the sun shone directly overhead in Siene, it cast a measurable shadow in Alexandria. By determining the angle of this shadow and the distance between the two cities, he could calculate the Earth's circumference using simple geometry. The measurement required coordinating observations across hundreds of miles, a logistical challenge that would have been impossible without the Ptolemaic administrative network that the library could command. The result was astonishing. Eratosthenes calculated Earth's circumference at approximately 252,000 stadia, which translates to roughly 39,690 kilometers, remarkably close to the actual value of 40,075 kilometers. The accuracy of this calculation, achieved with nothing more sophisticated than shadow measurements and mathematical reasoning, demonstrated both the power of systematic observation and the value of the library's comprehensive collection of astronomical data. His method would remain the standard approach for determining Earth's size until the development of more precise instruments centuries later. In the adjacent hall, Aristarchus of Samos was developing an even more revolutionary concept. Using similar geometric principles and observations recorded in the library's extensive astronomical archives, he proposed that the Earth and other planets revolved around the Sun. This heliocentric theory contradicted the prevailing geocentric model that placed Earth at the center of the universe, and it would not be widely accepted until Copernicus revived the idea nearly 18 centuries later. Aristarchus's work demonstrated the library's role in fostering not just compilation of existing knowledge, but genuine innovation that challenged established understanding. The medical achievements emerging from the Mausion were equally groundbreaking. Herophilus, working in the medical facilities equipped for systematic investigation, performed detailed anatomical studies that corrected numerous misconceptions about human physiology. His identification of the brain as the center of intelligence rather than the heart, as Aristotle had maintained, represented a fundamental shift in medical understanding. Using the library's extensive collection of Egyptian medical texts, the world's oldest medical literature, he combined traditional knowledge with systematic observation to create new approaches to diagnosis and treatment. Erasistratus, Herophilus's contemporary and colleague, advanced understanding of the circulatory system by distinguishing between arteries and veins and recognizing the heart's role as a pump. His work built upon the extensive collection of medical texts from across the Mediterranean world, demonstrating how the library's comprehensive collection enabled synthesis of knowledge from different traditions. The Alexandrian medical school became so renowned that physicians trained there were sought after throughout the Hellenistic world, spreading the institution's influence far beyond Egypt's borders. The library's impact on literary scholarship was equally profound. Aristophanes of Byzantium, whose encyclopedic memory became legendary, developed systematic approaches to textual criticism that established principles still used by scholars today. When examining different versions of Homer's epics, he did not simply choose the reading he preferred, but developed criteria for evaluating textual authenticity based on manuscript age, linguistic consistency, and historical evidence. His work on Homeric texts created the first critical edition of what would become Western literature's foundational works. Callimachus's Pinakes, the 120-scroll catalogue that organized the library's collection, represented an intellectual achievement in its own right. By creating systematic entries for each work that included not just title and author, but biographical information, textual variants, and evaluative commentary, he established principles of bibliographic organization that influenced library science for centuries. The Pinakes became a model for organizing knowledge that extended far beyond the library's walls, creating a framework for scholarly research that emphasized comprehensive documentation and critical evaluation. The mathematical breakthroughs emerging from the Mouse-Aeon were built upon the library's extensive collection of Babylonian and Egyptian mathematical texts, Egyptian computational methods, Babylonian astronomical calculations, and Greek geometric proofs were combined to create new approaches to solving complex problems. The development of trigonometry, the advancement of algebraic methods, and the refinement of geometric proofs all benefited from access to mathematical knowledge from across the ancient world. Euclidean geometry, while developed before the library's peak influence, was preserved, enhanced, and systematically taught within its halls. The elements became the foundation for mathematical education, not just in Alexandria, but throughout the Hellenistic world, with copies distributed through the library's extensive network of scholarly correspondence. The work's survival and influence can be directly attributed to the Mouse-Aeon's role as a center for mathematical study and preservation. The philosophical achievements associated with the library reflected its unique position as a meeting point for different intellectual traditions. Stoic philosophers found in its collection the resources to develop systematic approaches to ethics and physics. Epicurean scholars used its scientific texts to support their materialist understanding of the universe. Platonic and Aristotelian philosophers accessed comprehensive collections of their school's foundational texts, enabling more sophisticated development of systematic philosophy. The creation of the Septuagint, the Greek translation of Hebrew scriptures, represented a different kind of achievement, one that demonstrated the library's role in facilitating cultural exchange and religious understanding. This massive translation project, involving 72 scholars working independently to produce identical translations, became legendary and created the version of Jewish scriptures that would be most influential in the development of Christianity. The project's success established models for large-scale collaborative translation work that influenced later scholarly undertakings. These achievements were not isolated incidents but products of the unique environment the Mouse-Aeon created. The combination of comprehensive resources, systematic methodology, intellectual freedom within certain boundaries, and collaborative atmosphere enabled breakthroughs that required both individual genius and institutional support. Scholars like Eratosthenes could achieve their calculations because they had access to observations from across the Mediterranean world. Medical advances were possible because physicians could study texts from Egypt, Greece, Persia, and India in a single location. The library's influence extended beyond its immediate scholarly community through its graduates and correspondents. Physicians trained in Alexandria established medical schools throughout the Hellenistic world. Mathematicians who had studied its collections brought Alexandrian methods to other centers of learning. Philosophers who had debated in its halls carried its intellectual traditions to new audiences. The Mouseion had become not just a repository of knowledge, but a generator of new understanding that transformed the ancient world's intellectual landscape. Yet, even as these achievements reached their zenith, the institution that made them possible was beginning to face challenges that would eventually compromise its ability to continue fostering such breakthrough discoveries. Political pressures, financial constraints, and changing intellectual priorities would test the Mauseion's resilience and force adaptations that altered its fundamental character. The golden age of Alexandrian scholarship, built on the unique combination of royal patronage, scholarly dedication, and systematic methodology, was entering a period of gradual but significant transformation. As you consider these remarkable achievements, imagine the daily patience required for such work, the years of systematic observation, the careful comparison of texts, the patient calculation required to determine the size of a planet using nothing more than shadows and geometry. The intellectual breakthroughs of the Mouseion were not flashes of sudden inspiration, but the products of sustained systematic efforts supported by an institution designed to make such work possible. Their legacy reminds us that the greatest intellectual achievements often emerge not from individual genius alone, but from the patient accumulation of knowledge enabled by institutional support and collaborative effort. The story continues with how these achievements and the institution that produced them began to face challenges that would test their continued viability in a changing world. But first, you might wonder, how did the very success of the Mouseion scholarly program begin to create tensions within the broader Alexandrian society? And what happened when the political stability that made such work possible began to erode? The change came gradually, so subtly that many scholars barely noticed the shift in their daily routines. It began not with dramatic events, but with small inconveniences. A delay in the delivery of fresh papyrus, a reduction in the number of new books acquired each month, increasingly bureaucratic requirements for accessing special collections. These minor disruptions, when viewed individually, seemed like temporary inconveniences rather than signs of fundamental change. Yet they were early indicators of the political and economic pressures that would eventually transform the Mouseion from the ancient world's preeminent research institution into a shadow of its former glory. The first clear warning came in 145 BCE during the reign of Ptolemy VIII Physcon, whose rise to power was accompanied by violence and political purges that extended into the intellectual community. You would have been in your study when the announcement was made that Aristarchus of Samothrace, then head librarian and one of the most respected scholars of his generation, had resigned his position and exiled himself to Cyprus. The official explanation spoke of philosophical differences with the new regime, but the real reason was more troubling. The Ptolemaic dynasty was abandoning the tradition of supporting scholarship for its own sake, replacing it with a more instrumental approach that expected intellectual work to serve specific political purposes. The impact was immediate and personal for those who remained. The Mauseion's annual budget, once so generous that scholars could pursue research without concern for practical applications, began to contract. New acquisitions slowed to a trickle as Egypt's military commitments required ever larger shares of the royal treasury. The international network of book collectors, which had once stretched from the Black Sea to the Strait of Gibraltar, was gradually dismantled as agents were recalled or reassigned to more immediately productive tasks. You might have noticed that the weekly lectures once attended by dozens of eager students from across the Mediterranean, now attracted only local audiences, and even they were increasingly drawn away by new forms of entertainment offered by Rome's growing influence. The political climate in Alexandria was growing more complex and dangerous. The Ptolemaic dynasty, once so secure in its Egyptian base, found itself caught between Rome's expanding power and internal conflicts over succession and legitimacy. The Roman general Pompey would soon arrive in Alexandria seeking support for his civil war against Julius Caesar, bringing with him the chaos of Roman politics and military ambitions. The Mausion, designed to be insulated from such worldly concerns, found itself increasingly affected by the instability that characterized the late Ptolemaic period. The academic changes were equally significant. The systematic approach to scholarship that had characterized the Mausion's golden age began to give way to different priorities. New scholarship increasingly focused on synthesis and commentary rather than original research. This was not necessarily a decline in quality. The work of later Alexandrian scholars like Didymus the Brazen-Gutted, so called for his prolific output, demonstrated remarkable erudition and analytical skill, but it represented a shift from the groundbreaking discoveries of earlier centuries to more careful preservation and interpretation of existing knowledge. The demographic composition of the scholarly community also changed. During the Mausion's peak, scholars from across the Greek world competed for positions within its walls. By the 2nd century BCE, the institution was increasingly dominated by local Alexandrian scholars, many of whom held their positions through political connections rather than intellectual achievement. The rigorous standards that had once governed admission and advancement were gradually relaxed, creating an environment where competence was sometimes valued more highly than brilliance. Financial pressures affected not just book acquisitions, but the quality of life within the Mausion itself. The communal meals became simpler, the individual stipends were reduced, and maintenance of the physical facilities was deferred. You might have noticed that the gardens, once meticulously maintained as spaces for contemplation and informal discussion, were allowed to grow somewhat wild. The scriptorium, once equipped with the finest materials, now sometimes struggled to provide adequate papyrus and ink for the scribe's work. The international character that had made the Mausion unique began to fade as well. The network of corresponding scholars that had extended throughout the Mediterranean world contracted as political tensions made international cooperation more difficult. The regular correspondence between Alexandria and other major centers of learning, Athens, Pergamum, Rhodes, became less frequent and less substantial. New ideas and discoveries that might once have circulated rapidly among the intellectual community now traveled more slowly or not at all. Perhaps most significantly, the relationship between scholarship and political power became increasingly troubled. The Mausion had always existed at the pleasure of the ruling dynasty, but during its golden age, the Ptolemies had generally maintained a hands-off approach to the content and direction of scholarly work. This changed as political instability made rulers more sensitive to potential criticism or challenges to their authority. Scholars found themselves navigating increasingly complex restrictions on what they could study, teach, or publish. The rise of Rome as the dominant Mediterranean power added another layer of complexity. While Roman rule initially brought some stability to Egypt, it also fundamentally altered the nature of intellectual patronage. Rome's approach to supporting scholarship was different from the Ptolemies, more instrumental, less generous, and increasingly focused on serving practical rather than purely intellectual purposes. The Mausion survived the transition to Roman rule, but as a diminished institution, its best days behind it. Technological changes also began to affect the Mausion's operations. The gradual shift from papyrus to parchment as the primary writing medium required adjustments in preservation and storage techniques. The scribes had to learn new methods for preparing writing surfaces and different approaches to copying and preserving texts. These changes were manageable but required resources and attention that might otherwise have been devoted to scholarly research. The academic standards that had made Alexandrian scholarship so influential began to erode in subtle ways. The rigorous peer review and critical analysis that had characterized earlier work was sometimes replaced by more cursory examination. The comprehensive documentation that had been a hallmark of Callimachus's Pinnaces was not maintained with the same thoroughness by his successors. You might have noticed that new catalogue entries became less detailed, less comprehensive, and sometimes less accurate than the meticulous records compiled during the library's golden age. Despite these challenges, the Mouseion continued to function and even to produce significant scholarship. The work of Aristarchus of Samothrace in the 2nd century BCE represented a continuation of the institution's tradition of literary scholarship, even as political pressures increasingly complicated his work. His critical editions of Homeric texts, building upon the methods established by earlier Alexandrian scholars, remained influential long after his departure into exile. The gradual nature of the Mouseion's decline was perhaps its most striking characteristic. There was no single catastrophic event that destroyed the institution or ended its scholarly mission. Instead, a series of incremental changes, budget cuts, political restrictions, shifts in intellectual priorities, and gradual erosion of standards combined to transform it from the ancient world's premier research institution into a competent but unremarkable center of learning. By the time of the Roman Empire, the Mouseion still existed, still supported scholars, still maintained its collection, but it no longer represented the cutting edge of human intellectual achievement. The implications of this decline extended far beyond Alexandria itself. The Mouseion had served as a model for other institutions of learning throughout the Hellenistic world. Its decline signaled a broader shift away from the systematic, comprehensive approach to knowledge that had characterized the Hellenistic period. The emphasis among intellectuals gradually shifted from synthesis and universal understanding to specialization and practical application. The conditions that had made the Mouseion possible, the combination of royal wealth, political stability, and intellectual ambition, were becoming increasingly rare in the ancient world. As you prepare for sleep, consider how institutions that seem permanent and successful can gradually decline without any dramatic failure or catastrophe. The Mouseion story reminds us that the maintenance of high intellectual standards requires constant attention and support. Political stability, financial security, and institutional commitment are not just background conditions for scholarship, but essential requirements for sustained intellectual achievement. When these elements erode gradually, the decline can be almost invisible to those experiencing it, becoming apparent only in retrospect when comparing current achievements to past glories. The story continues with how the famous destruction of the Library of Alexandria occurred, not as a single catastrophic event, but through a series of incidents that reflected the broader political and cultural changes transforming the ancient Mediterranean world. But first, you might wonder what finally happened to this once great institution. How does an intellectual center of such prominence simply fade away? And what becomes of its accumulated knowledge when the institution that preserved it can no longer maintain its collection? The morning of October 48 BCE began like any other in Alexandria, with the Mediterranean sun rising over the lighthouse that had become the city's iconic landmark, its bronze mirrors reflecting light that could be seen for miles across the sea. You would have seen the usual bustle of port activity, merchant ships unloading their cargo of grain from the Nile Valley, fishing boats returning with their overnight catch, and naval vessels of the Egyptian fleet making their way to their moorings in the great harbor. But by nightfall, this ordinary scene would be transformed into chaos that would reshape the intellectual history of the ancient world. The immediate cause of what would become known as the burning of the Library of Alexandria was Julius Caesar's ill-fated intervention in Egyptian politics. Caesar had arrived in Alexandria in pursuit of his rival Pompey, who had fled there after their military confrontation at Pharsalus. What began as a diplomatic mission to resolve the Roman civil war spilled over into local Egyptian politics when Caesar became embroiled in the dynastic struggle between Cleopatra and her brother Ptolemy VIII. You would have seen Caesar's Roman legions establishing defensive positions around the royal quarter, where the Mausoleum and its library were located, as tensions escalated between the Roman forces and the Egyptian army supporting Ptolemy. The actual fire began accidentally, according to most ancient accounts, when Caesar ordered his troops to set fire to ships in the harbor to prevent them from falling into enemy hands. The Egyptian fleet, largely manned by Greek mercenaries and Egyptian conscripts, posed a significant threat to Caesar's position within the city. His decision to burn these vessels made tactical sense from a military perspective, but it failed to account for the unpredictable nature of fire in an ancient city built largely of wood and other flammable materials. The fire spread with terrifying speed. Ancient Alexandria's dense urban layout, with its narrow streets and closely packed buildings, created perfect conditions for what would become a major conflagration. The flames jumped from ship to ship in the harbor, then spread into the dockside warehouses where merchants stored their goods. These warehouses, filled with papyrus, grain, oil, and other combustible materials, became infernos that sent burning debris flying through the air. Contemporary accounts differ significantly on the extent of the damage to the library itself. Seneca the Younger, writing in the 1st century CE, quotes Livy's lost history as stating that 40,000 scrolls were destroyed in the fire. The Greek historian Cassius Dio, writing 2 centuries later, describes how many places were set on fire, with the result that, along with other buildings, the dockyards and storehouses of grain and books, said to be great in number and of the finest, were burned. And the key phrase here is along with other buildings. It suggests that the fire affected storage facilities rather than the main library structure itself. Modern scholars have reached a consensus that challenges the traditional narrative of the library's complete destruction in 48 BCE. The available evidence suggests that while some portion of the library's collection was indeed lost, particularly texts stored in warehouse facilities near the harbor, the Mausoleum itself survived the fire largely intact. Strabo, the Greek geographer who visited Alexandria around 20 BCE, decades after the Caesar fire, mentions visiting the Mausoleum and describes it as still functioning, though he notably does not mention the library separately. This omission has been interpreted by some scholars as evidence that the library's prestige and significance had already diminished considerably by that time. The practical impact of the fire, regardless of its exact scope, was significant. Even if the main library building survived, the loss of any portion of the collection represented a major blow to Alexandria's status as the ancient world's premier repository of knowledge. The library's reputation for comprehensiveness was based on its claim to universal collection, and any reduction in its holdings undermined this fundamental aspect of its identity. The fire also revealed the vulnerability of knowledge stored in physical form. The Alexandrian library represented humanity's first systematic attempt to create a comprehensive archive of written knowledge, yet this ambitious project was dependent on materials, papyrus, parchment, wood-built storage facilities that were inherently fragile. The irony was stark. The greatest collection of human knowledge in the ancient world could be threatened by something as simple as a cooking fire spreading out of control during a military conflict. Recovery efforts began almost immediately after the fire was extinguished. Mark Antony, according to later accounts, attempted to replenish the library's collection by gifting Cleopatra 200,000 scrolls from the Library of Pergamum. Whether this story is historically accurate or merely romantic legend is debated by modern historians, but it reflects the understanding that major losses required substantial efforts at replacement. The process of rebuilding would have been complicated by the same logistical challenges that had made the original collection so valuable. finding and acquiring rare texts from across the Mediterranean world. The longer-term consequences of the Caesar fire extended beyond the immediate physical damage. The incident revealed the political vulnerability of institutions that depended on royal patronage and political stability. The Mausion's survival was directly linked to the Ptolemaic dynasty's continued rule, and the dynasty's involvement in Roman civil wars made its future increasingly uncertain. You would have seen scholars beginning to make contingency plans, considering whether to remain in Alexandria or seek positions elsewhere. The fire also marked a psychological turning point in how the library was perceived. The confidence that had characterized the institution during its golden age, the assumption that its comprehensive collection would endure indefinitely, was replaced by a more anxious awareness of physical vulnerability. This psychological shift may have been as significant as any material losses, affecting how scholars approached their work and how the institution planned for its future. Financial pressures intensified throughout the Roman period. The imperial treasury, stretched thin by military commitments and administrative expenses across the vast empire, provided minimal support for what was increasingly seen as a luxury institution. Scholars who had once received generous stipends found their income reduced or eliminated entirely. The scriptorium, which had employed dozens of scribes to copy and preserve texts, operated with skeleton crews that could barely maintain existing collections, much less expand them. The quality of the collection itself began to deteriorate through neglect rather than catastrophe. Papyrus scrolls, never permanent by modern standards, required regular copying and maintenance to remain usable. As resources for these preservation activities dwindled, portions of the collection simply became unusable through natural decay. You might have noticed that certain sections of the catalogue became increasingly theoretical. The scrolls they described still existed physically but had deteriorated beyond the point of being readable. The international scholarly network that had once connected Alexandria to other major centers of learning gradually contracted. Roman administrative priorities did not include maintaining foreign scholarly correspondence, and the library's budget for international acquisition and exchange dried up. The regular flow of new ideas and discoveries from Athens, Pergamum, Rhodes, and other intellectual centers slowed to a trickle, then stopped entirely. Technological changes also affected the institution's operation. The gradual shift from papyrus to parchment as the primary writing medium required adjustments in preservation and storage techniques that the financially constrained library could not always accommodate. The transition was manageable but required resources and attention that might otherwise have been devoted to scholarly research. The political stability that had been essential to the library's operations became increasingly uncertain during the turbulent 3rd century CE. The crisis of the 3rd century, marked by frequent changes of emperors, economic instability, and external threats, made long-term scholarly planning impossible. The Mausion survived these troubled times, but at the cost of further institutional deterioration. The major destructions that marked the library's final centuries were not single catastrophic events, but cumulative losses that reflected the broader decline of the Roman Empire in the West. The palace of the Ptolemies, which had housed the main library collection, was destroyed during the Emperor Aurelian's reconquest of Alexandria from the Palmyrene Empire in 272 CE. This military action, necessary to restore imperial control over Egypt, effectively ended whatever remained of the original library facilities. The subsequent destruction of the Serapeum, the daughter library that had served as a public branch of the institution in 391 CE, marked another significant loss. This destruction was not accidental but deliberate, part of the Christian efforts to eliminate pagan institutions throughout the empire. The religious motivations for this action reflected the broader cultural transformation that was making institutions like the Mausion not just financially unviable, but ideologically unacceptable. Modern archaeological investigation has provided insight into the gradual nature of the library's decline. Excavations in Alexandria have revealed evidence of multiple destructions over several centuries, including layers of ash from the Caesar fire, debris from Aurelian's conquest, and the systematic destruction of pagan structures during the Christianization period. These findings support the understanding that the library's disappearance was not the result of a single catastrophic event, but rather a long process of gradual decline punctuated by several major disasters. The final phase of the library's existence was marked by institutional persistence despite increasingly adverse conditions. The Mausoleum continued to be mentioned in legal documents and historical accounts well into the 4th century CE, but references become increasingly formulaic, acknowledging the institution's traditional prestige rather than describing active scholarly work. By the time of the Arab conquest in 642 CE, the Great Library's collections had long since been dispersed or destroyed, and its facilities had been repurposed or abandoned. Understanding the library's decline as a gradual process rather than a single catastrophic destruction provides important insight into how institutions evolve and eventually disappear. The factors that contributed to the Mausoleum's decline, financial pressure, changing political priorities, cultural transformation, and accumulated neglect, operated slowly over centuries, creating a process that was almost invisible to those living through it. The final disappearance of the institution represented not the failure of a specific moment, but the culmination of long-term trends that made its continued existence impossible. As you reflect on this long decline, consider the resilience required to maintain institutional purpose, despite generations of diminishing resources and support. The scholars who continued to work within the Mausoleum's walls during its final centuries were not less dedicated than their predecessors, but they operated in circumstances that made their task increasingly difficult. Their story illustrates how even the greatest intellectual institutions are vulnerable to the broader political, economic and cultural forces that shape the societies that support them. The story continues with the most famous of the library's supposed destructions, the often repeated but historically questionable account of its destruction by Arab conquerors in 642 CE. But first, you might wonder what actually happened during the Arab conquest, and why has this event become so central to popular understanding of the library's fate when the evidence for it is so questionable? The most famous story about the Library of Alexandria's destruction is also the one most thoroughly discredited by modern historical scholarship. According to this widely circulated tale, when the Arab general Amr ibn al-As conquered Alexandria in 642 CE, he discovered the library's vast collection of books and, following the orders of the Caliph Umar, ordered them all burned. The story claims that the books provided fuel for the city's public baths for 6 months, serving the dual purpose of destroying pagan knowledge and providing practical heat for the conqueror's hygienic needs. This dramatic narrative has been repeated so often that it has become almost canonical in popular understanding of the library's fate. Yet, like many compelling historical stories, it dissolves under careful scrutiny. The account first appears in sources written centuries after the supposed event, primarily in the works of 13th century historians like Gregory Bar Hebraeus and Abd al-Latif al-Baghdadi. These writers, living in a very different political and religious environment, had clear motives for creating a narrative that emphasized Muslim destruction of classical learning. The historical reality is far more complex and considerably less dramatic. By the time of the Arab conquest in 642 CE, the Mausoleum and its library had ceased to be significant intellectual institutions for nearly 3 centuries. The main library building in the royal quarter had been destroyed during the fighting between Aurelian and Zenobia in 272 CE. The Serapeum, the last substantial collection of texts associated with the Great Library's tradition, had been destroyed deliberately in 391 CE as part of the Christian campaign against pagan institutions. Whatever survived these earlier disasters was scattered, damaged, or lost through the general neglect that characterized the The late Roman period in Alexandria. The Arab conquerors who entered Alexandria in 642 CE would have found a city whose glory days were clearly in the past. The magnificent buildings of the Ptolemaic era were in various states of ruin or repurposing. The intellectual infrastructure that had made Alexandria the Mediterranean's premier center of learning had been dismantled or abandoned. Any remaining books would have been in private collections or scattered through the various small libraries that had replaced the great Mausion, not concentrated in a single location that could provide fuel for 6 months of heating. The persistence of the Arab destruction myth reveals much about how historical narratives are constructed and why certain stories survive, despite contradictory evidence. The tale serves multiple purposes for different audiences. It provides a simple explanation for the loss of classical learning, reinforces narratives of conflict between religious traditions, and offers a dramatic moment of destruction that satisfies our desire for clear causes and effects in history. The reality, a long, slow decline through multiple causes over several centuries, lacks the narrative satisfaction of a single catastrophic event. Modern archaeological investigation has provided additional evidence against the Arab destruction theory. Excavations in Alexandria have revealed layers of destruction from multiple periods. The Caesar fire of 48 BCE, the Aurelian conquest of 272 CE, the Christian destruction of the Serapeum in 391 CE, but no evidence of widespread book burning during the 7th century CE. The material record instead supports a gradual process of decline and abandonment rather than a single destructive event. The actual fate of the Library of Alexandria was determined not by any single catastrophic event, but by a combination of factors that operated over centuries. Political instability made long-term planning impossible. Financial constraints gradually reduced the institution's ability to maintain its collection and facilities. Cultural changes, including the rise of Christianity and the shift from Greek to Roman to Arab political control, altered the intellectual environment in ways that made the Mausion's traditional approach to knowledge increasingly irrelevant. The books themselves, the physical manifestation of the library's mission, faced their own natural enemies. Papyrus, the primary writing material of the ancient world, is remarkably durable in Egypt's dry climate, but is not permanent. Without the continuous maintenance that had characterized the Ptolemaic period, regular copying, careful storage, systematic preservation, scrolls gradually became unreadable through natural decay. This process, accelerated by the neglect that accompanied political and financial decline, would have eliminated most of the collection regardless of any human actions. The disappearance of the library's scholarly community followed a similar pattern. As resources diminished and opportunities for significant research decreased, the most talented scholars began to seek positions elsewhere. The network of international correspondence that had connected Alexandria to other centers of learning gradually withered away. The teaching traditions that had been maintained through successive generations of scholars were not replenished with new talent and fresh perspectives. By the time of the Arab conquest, the Mausion was no longer the vibrant intellectual community that had once attracted the ancient world's greatest minds. The transformation of Alexandria's intellectual character was part of broader changes affecting the Mediterranean world. The decline of Hellenistic civilization, the rise of the Roman Empire, the spread of Christianity, and the eventual Arab conquest each brought fundamental changes to how knowledge was created, preserved, and transmitted. The Library of Alexandria, designed for a specific cultural and political environment, could not adapt to these successive transformations. Its disappearance represents not the failure of a particular civilization or religion, but the natural obsolescence of an institution whose underlying conditions had ceased to exist. The persistence of the Arab destruction myth, despite historical evidence to the contrary, also illustrates the role of storytelling in shaping historical understanding. The dramatic image of ancient wisdom being destroyed by religious intolerance provides a compelling narrative that satisfies emotional needs for clear villains and victims. The complex reality of institutional decline through multiple causes over centuries lacks this narrative appeal, even though it more accurately reflects historical processes. Understanding the true fate of the Library of Alexandria, the slow decline rather than sudden destruction, the multiple causes rather than single villain, the gradual obsolescence rather than dramatic end, provides insight into how institutions function and fail. The Mausion's disappearance was not unique, but representative of how even the most successful human undertakings are vulnerable to changing circumstances that they cannot control or even fully understand. The library's legacy, however, extends far beyond its physical disappearance. The model it established for systematic knowledge collection, the scholarly methods it pioneered, and the intellectual achievements it fostered became part of the broader heritage of human civilization. These elements survived even as the institution that created them passed away, influence that continue to shape how we understand and organize knowledge today. As you consider this complex history, think about how the stories we tell about the past often reflect our present concerns more than historical reality. The Arab destruction narrative emerged during periods of religious conflict and continues to be retold because it serves contemporary purposes. Understanding the actual historical processes that led to the library's decline, not through sudden catastrophe, but through the accumulation of challenges over centuries, offers a different kind of lesson about how institutions function and ultimately disappear. The morning mist would have been lifting from Alexandria's eastern harbor as you approached the magnificent temple complex dedicated to Serapis, the syncretic god who combined Greek and Egyptian elements into a deity that represented the cultural fusion that made Alexandria unique. Built in the 3rd century BCE under Ptolemy III, the Serapeum was not merely a religious sanctuary, but what modern scholars call a daughter library, a public extension of the Great Mausion, designed to make knowledge more accessible to the broader population of Alexandria, unlike the royal library in the Bruttian Quarter, which was primarily reserved for scholars with official appointments. The Serapeum represented a revolutionary concept in the ancient world, a public library where educated citizens could access significant collections of texts without the formal credentials required for Mausion membership. This democratization of knowledge was part of the Ptolemy's broader vision for Alexandria as not just a center of learning for elites, but as a city where education and culture permeated all levels of society. The architecture of the Serapeum reflected its dual role as both temple and library. The main sanctuary, built of limestone and marble, rose to a height of over 100 feet, with massive columns supporting a pediment decorated with elaborate carvings depicting mythological scenes. Within this sacred space stood the colossal statue of Serapis, carved from wood and covered with precious metals, showing the god seated on a throne with a corn measure, modius, on his head, symbolizing abundance and prosperity. The statue's face was painted black, representing the fusion of Egyptian and Greek elements, while the figure's pose and drapery reflected classical Greek artistic traditions. The library collection itself was housed in a separate complex of buildings connected to the temple by colonnaded walkways. These structures contained reading rooms, lecture halls, and storage facilities that could accommodate substantial numbers of texts and scholars. Unlike the Mausion's specialized focus on research and advanced scholarship, the Serapeum's collection emphasized works that would be useful for general education, copies of Homer and other classical authors, mathematics texts suitable for teaching, medical treatises and philosophical works written in accessible language rather than the highly technical treatises. Favored by Mausion scholars, the catalog system developed for the Serapeum borrowed heavily from the organizational methods pioneered by Callimachus in the main library, but it was adapted for a collection that needed to serve different purposes. Instead of attempting to collect every work on every subject, the Serapeum focused on acquiring multiple copies of important texts so they could be used simultaneously by different readers. This approach reflected the practical recognition that a public library's mission differed from that of a comprehensive research institution. Access to the Serapeum's collection was controlled but not restricted in the same way as the Mouseion. Citizens of Alexandria who could demonstrate adequate education and good character could obtain reading privileges, though they were expected to follow strict protocols for handling texts. The rooms where books were stored were open during specified hours, with attendants who could retrieve requested texts and provide basic assistance. This service represented a significant innovation in ancient library practice, anticipating modern public library service models. The Serapeum's role as a temple of Serapis created unique opportunities and challenges for its operation as a library. The syncretic nature of the Serapis cult, combining elements of the Egyptian gods Osiris and Apis with the Greek god Zeus, meant that the institution served a religiously diverse community. Greeks, Egyptians, Jews, and later Christians could all find elements of their own traditions within the Serapis mythology, creating an atmosphere of relative religious tolerance that was essential for scholarly work. This religious flexibility became increasingly important as Christianity began to spread throughout Alexandria. While the Mauseion's pagan associations made it suspect to Christian authorities, the Serapeum's more ecumenical atmosphere allowed it to continue operating even as religious tensions increased. The temple's priests, educated in both Greek philosophy and traditional Egyptian wisdom, often served as intermediaries between different religious communities, facilitating scholarly exchanges that might otherwise have been impossible. The collection development policy for the Serapeum reflected its public mission. While the Mouseion focused on acquiring the oldest and most authentic manuscripts, often at enormous expense, the Serapeum prioritized practical utility. Texts were selected based on their educational value, their relevance to current intellectual debates, and their accessibility to general readers. This approach meant that the Serapeum often acquired texts that the Mouseion might have overlooked, including contemporary works, simplified versions of complex treatises, and materials in languages other than Greek. The Serapeum also served as an important center for translation work. Its staff included specialists in Egyptian, Hebrew, and other languages who could translate important texts for Greek-speaking audiences. This translation activity made the institution particularly valuable for scholars who needed access to materials in languages they could not read themselves. The most famous product of this translation work was the Greek version of the Hebrew scriptures, known as the Septuagint, which was completed in the Serapeum and became the standard text for Greek-speaking Jews and early Christians. The physical management of the collection required different techniques than those used in the Mouseion. Because the Serapeum served many simultaneous users, wear and tear on texts was a significant concern. Scribes were employed not just to copy texts, but to repair damaged scrolls, replace broken handles, and restore faded writing. This maintenance work was essential for keeping the collection usable, as the constant handling by readers would otherwise have quickly rendered texts unusable. The relationship between the Serapeum and the main library was complex and complementary. While the Mouseion scholars might have viewed the Serapeum as a simplified version of their own institution, they also recognized its value for promoting general education and public support for scholarly work. The Serapeum's more accessible approach to knowledge helped maintain Alexandria's reputation as a center of learning and ensured that the benefits of scholarship extended beyond the small community of professional researchers as political and religious tensions increased throughout the late Roman period. The Serapeum's moderate position became increasingly challenging to maintain. Its association with pagan religion made it suspect to Christian authorities, while its intellectual activities appeared threatening to those who sought to impose religious uniformity. The institution's ability to serve as a bridge between different communities, once its greatest strength, became a source of vulnerability in an age of increasing polarization and conflict. The daily operations of the Serapeum would have been familiar to anyone who has worked in a modern public library. Attendants helped readers locate texts, answered basic reference questions, and maintained order in the reading areas. Scholars conducted research, prepared lectures, and engaged in debates about interpretation of texts. Merchants, students, and interested citizens came to read, to learn, and to participate in the intellectual life of one of the ancient world's most sophisticated cities. As you consider the Serapeum's role in Alexandria's intellectual community, think about how public institutions serve different purposes than specialized research facilities. The democratization of knowledge that the Serapeum represented was not just a matter of making texts available to more people. It was about creating a culture where learning was integrated into daily life rather than confined to elite institutions. This vision of education as a public good would influence subsequent developments in library science and educational theory. The story continues with how the Serapeum's unique position became increasingly precarious as Alexandria's religious and political climate changed, leading to the dramatic events that would end both its function as a library and its existence as a temple. But first, you might wonder, how did this institution of learning and tolerance survive as long as it did, and what made it ultimately vulnerable to the forces that would bring about its destruction? On a cool March morning in 415 CE, you might have seen Hypatia making her way through Alexandria's busy streets, her distinctive philosopher's cloak marking her as someone of significance in a city where appearance still carried meaning. At nearly 60 years old, she remained one of Alexandria's most prominent intellectuals, renowned not just for her mathematical and astronomical expertise, but for her ability to make complex philosophical ideas accessible to students from various religious and social backgrounds. Her daily routine reflected both the traditions of Alexandrian scholarship and the changing realities of a city where the intellectual freedom that had characterized the Mausion's golden age was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. Hypatia's background was ideally suited to the Alexandrian tradition of synthesis and collaboration. Her father, Theon, had been the last recorded member of the Mausion, continuing its scholarly traditions even as the institution itself faded into obscurity. Under his guidance, she had mastered mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy, developing the kind of comprehensive education that had once been standard for Alexandrian scholars, but was becoming rare in an age of increasing specialization. Her expertise was practical as well as theoretical. Letters from her student Synesius, who would later become Bishop of Cyrene, describe how she taught him to design and construct an astrolabe, the sophisticated astronomical instrument that served as both a calculator and a teaching tool. Her teaching methods reflected the Alexandrian emphasis on making knowledge accessible without sacrificing intellectual rigor. She held regular public lectures in Alexandria's central areas, explaining the complexities of Platonic and Aristotelian philosophy to audiences that included pagans, Christians, and Jews. The Neoplatonist philosophy she espoused emphasized the unity of all reality and the possibility of human intellectual development through systematic study and contemplation. This philosophical approach, with its emphasis on rational inquiry and universal truth, appealed to educated Alexandrians regardless of their religious affiliations, and provided a framework for intellectual cooperation. Across sectarian boundaries, her mathematical work continued, the Alexandrian tradition of textual scholarship combined with original research. She produced commentaries on Diophantus's Arithmetica and Apollonius's Conics, works that represented the pinnacle of ancient mathematical achievement. These commentaries were not merely explanatory notes, but sophisticated analyses that clarified difficult concepts, provided alternative proofs, and extended the original author's methods to new problems. Her approach reflected the Mausion's tradition of using comprehensive analysis of existing texts as a foundation for advancing human understanding. The political and religious context of Hypatia's scholarly career was one of increasing tension and conflict. The Roman Empire had officially adopted Christianity as its state religion, and the process of eliminating pagan institutions was accelerating throughout the empire. In Alexandria, this transformation was particularly dramatic because of the city's long association with pagan learning and its large, well-educated pagan population. The Serapeum's destruction in 391 CE, only a generation before Hypatia's prominence, had demonstrated both the Christian community's determination to eliminate pagan institutions and the emperor's willingness to support such actions through imperial decree. Yet Hypatia's career flourished within this challenging environment, suggesting that Alexandria's intellectual traditions maintained remarkable resilience even as their institutional foundations crumbled. Her home became a center of intellectual activity where students from various religious backgrounds gathered to study mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy. The fact that Synesius, one of her most devoted students, became a Christian bishop while maintaining his pagan philosophical education indicates the complex ways that classical learning and Christian doctrine could coexist at individual levels, even as their institutional supports disappeared. Her astronomical work represented a continuation of the Alexandrian tradition of systematic observation combined with theoretical analysis. She produced an astronomical table, or possibly refined existing tables, that was used for calculating planetary positions and predicting eclipses. This work, like her mathematical commentaries, combined technical expertise with pedagogical clarity, making complex astronomical knowledge accessible to her students and readers. The astrolabe she taught Synesius to construct was both a practical instrument for navigation and timekeeping, and a sophisticated demonstration of astronomical principles. The question of Hypatia's religious identity has been debated by historians, reflecting broader uncertainties about how to characterize intellectual life in late antique Alexandria. She was clearly not Christian in the orthodox sense of her era, but her Neoplatonist philosophy contained elements that resonated with Christian theological concepts. Her emphasis on the unity of truth and the possibility of human intellectual development toward divine understanding could be interpreted as compatible with Christian teaching, even though her pagan philosophical framework was officially unacceptable. This ambiguity may have contributed to her ability to maintain relationships across religious boundaries while also making her vulnerable to accusations of religious deviance. Her relationship with Alexandria's political authorities was complex and ultimately fatal. As a prominent public intellectual, she had connections to both the civil and religious leadership of the city. She maintained friendly relations with Orestes, the Roman governor, who consulted her on matters of administration and policy. This association with civil authority became dangerous as conflicts developed between the governor and Cyril, the Christian patriarch of Alexandria. The political dimensions of these disputes were complicated by religious tensions, ethnic divisions within the city's population, and competition for control of Alexandria's institutions. Her public lectures, once a source of her renown, became increasingly controversial as the political atmosphere deteriorated. The Neoplatonist philosophy she taught emphasized the sovereignty of reason and the possibility of achieving truth through intellectual inquiry, principles that could be interpreted as challenging to religious authorities who claimed exclusive access to truth through revelation. Her popularity among students and her influence with political leaders made her a visible target for those who sought to eliminate pagan influence from Alexandrian public life. The circumstances of her death reflect the ways that intellectual life in Alexandria had become entangled with broader conflicts that transcended scholarly disputes. The immediate cause was a rumor, almost certainly false, that she was preventing reconciliation between Cyril and Orestes. The actual motivations were more complex, involving deep-seated religious tensions, political rivalries, and probably personal vendettas. Her murder by a Christian mob represented not just an attack on an individual, but an assault on the tradition of rational inquiry that she personified. The manner of her death, being dragged from her carriage into a church, where she was beaten and ultimately killed, was calculated to demonstrate the supremacy of Christian religious authority over pagan intellectual traditions. The choice of a church as the site for her murder was symbolically significant, representing the replacement of rational philosophical inquiry with revealed religious truth. The destruction of her body, reportedly burned afterward to prevent veneration of her remains, was intended to eliminate not just her physical presence, but any possibility of her continued influence. Yet Hypatia's intellectual legacy survived her physical destruction in ways that her killers could not have anticipated or prevented. Her student Synesius preserved many of her teachings and incorporated her philosophical approach into his own theological work. The mathematical and astronomical texts she produced continued to be studied and copied, ensuring that her contributions to human knowledge remained accessible to subsequent generations. Perhaps most significantly, her life and death became emblematic of the tensions between reason and faith, tolerance and orthodoxy that would continue to shape intellectual history long after her death. The timing of Hypatia's career, spanning the period from the Mausion's decline to the final elimination of pagan institutions, makes her symbolic of Alexandria's intellectual traditions in their final flowering. She represented the continuation of systematic scholarly inquiry even as the institutional supports for such work disappeared. Her ability to maintain productive relationships across religious boundaries demonstrated the possibility of intellectual cooperation, even in an age of increasing sectarian conflict. As you consider Hypatia's career and its significance, think about the role of individual scholarship in maintaining intellectual traditions when their institutional foundations have crumbled. Her work demonstrates that knowledge and inquiry can survive the loss of libraries, research institutions, and official support, even though such survival is more precarious and less comprehensive than institutional preservation would allow. The Alexandrian tradition of rational inquiry that she embodied became part of the broader heritage of human knowledge, influence that extends beyond the physical manuscripts and official positions that characterized the Mausion's golden age. Her story also illustrates the complex relationship between intellectual life and political power in periods of significant cultural transition. Hypatia's position as a public intellectual required her to navigate between competing authorities with conflicting priorities and values. Her death demonstrates the vulnerability of scholars when their work intersects with larger political and religious conflicts that they cannot control or even fully understand. Yet her intellectual achievements also show how individual dedication to truth and rational inquiry can maintain and advance human knowledge, even in the most challenging circumstances. The story concludes with the final chapter of Alexandrian scholarship, but not with the complete disappearance of the intellectual traditions that had made the city famous. As you prepare for sleep, consider how Hypatia's career represents both the fragility and the resilience of human knowledge. Physical institutions can be destroyed, official positions eliminated, and individual scholars silenced. But the patterns of thought and methods of inquiry that characterize genuine intellectual achievement can survive and influence subsequent generations in ways that are difficult to predict or control. The destruction of the Serapeum in 391 CE marked not just the end of Alexandria's daughter library, but the final elimination of the institutional structures that had supported pagan learning in the city for nearly 7 centuries. The event was both a religious and cultural watershed, representing the complete triumph of Christianity over the syncretic pagan traditions that had made Alexandria unique among ancient cities. Understanding how this destruction occurred provides insight into how revolutionary cultural changes eliminate existing institutions while creating new ones, and why the tradition of Alexandrian scholarship could not survive this final transformation. The immediate cause of the Serapeum's destruction was the broader campaign against pagan institutions throughout the Roman Empire. Emperor Theodosius I, ruling from 379 to 395 CE, had issued a series of decrees that made Nicene Christianity the empire's sole recognized religion and prohibited pagan practices. In Alexandria, these imperial policies were implemented by Theophilus, the Christian patriarch, who had earned a reputation for enthusiasm in his efforts to eliminate pagan influence from the city. You would have seen the beginnings of this campaign in the gradual closure of pagan temples, the prohibition of traditional festivals, and the increasing pressure on educated pagans to convert or at least cease their public religious practices. The specific events leading to the Serapeum's destruction began with Theophilus's provocative actions against pagan symbols. Following the imperial decree that prohibited pagan worship, Theophilus ordered the confiscation of cult objects from various temples throughout Alexandria. Rather than simply storing or destroying these items, he chose to display them publicly, holding them up to ridicule in the streets as demonstrations of the falsity of pagan beliefs. This calculated insult to traditional religion was undoubtedly intended to provoke a response from Alexandria's substantial pagan population, which still included many of the city's most educated and influential citizens. The response came quickly and violently. A riot erupted in which Christians were killed, creating the pretext for more drastic action against pagan institutions. The pagans of Alexandria, led by prominent citizens who were probably among the Serapeum's regular patrons, took refuge in the temple complex and fortified it against attack. From within the Serapeum's walls, they harassed the Christian population and reportedly forced captured Christians to participate in pagan rituals under threat of torture. This defiance of imperial authority and Christian supremacy could not be tolerated by the secular authorities, regardless of the religious dimension of the conflict. The imperial government's response was swift and decisive. Emperor Theodosius issued a rescript specifically addressing the Alexandrian situation, declaring that those killed while defending the Serapeum were to be considered martyrs and ordering the temple's complete destruction. The pagan defenders were to be pardoned, a pragmatic decision that acknowledged the political reality that mass punishment would have been impossible to implement, but the temple itself was to be eliminated entirely. The official justification was that removing the source of conflict would eliminate the disagreements it had provoked. The actual destruction was carried out with systematic thoroughness. The Christian mob, led by monks who had a reputation for violence in the service of religious orthodoxy, assaulted the temple complex with a combination of official approval and popular enthusiasm. The most dramatic moment came when the great statue of Serapis was attacked. Even among Christian believers, there was hesitation to strike the first blow against an image that had been revered for centuries. When a soldier, presumably acting under orders from Theophilus, finally used an axe to destroy the statue's head, the act was followed by the more extensive demolition that reduced the entire monument to rubble. The destruction was not merely symbolic, but comprehensive. The temple's libraries, which had contained significant collections of texts that represented centuries of Alexandrian scholarship, were burned or otherwise destroyed. The reading rooms where Hypatia may have studied and taught were reduced to ruins. Academic equipment, astronomical instruments, and other scholarly tools were smashed or appropriated. The scale of the destruction was such that it effectively eliminated any possibility of the institution's recovery or restoration. The aftermath of the destruction revealed the broader implications of this cultural revolution. On the site of the Serapeum, a church was constructed, symbolically representing the complete replacement of pagan learning with Christian religious authority. The transformation was not just architectural but intellectual. Alexandria's educational focus shifted permanently from the comprehensive study of all human knowledge to the systematic exposition of Christian doctrine. The catechetical school, which had been established to train Christian clergy and teach converts, became the city's dominant intellectual institution, while other forms of scholarship were either eliminated or subordinated to theological purposes. The impact on Alexandria's scholarly community was immediate and devastating. The network of pagan intellectuals who had maintained the traditions of classical learning, even as the institutions that supported them disappeared, lost their last major public space for meeting, study, and teaching. Private instruction continued, as Hypatia's subsequent career demonstrated, but without public institutional support, such activities became increasingly precarious and isolated. The social connections that had linked Alexandria's pagan intellectuals to the broader civic community were severed, leaving individual scholars vulnerable to the kinds of attacks that would ultimately claim Hypatia's life. The destruction also had significant implications for the preservation and transmission of classical knowledge. While some texts were certainly saved through the efforts of individual scholars, the systematic elimination of Alexandria's major collections meant that significant portions of the ancient world's intellectual heritage were lost permanently. The process was not necessarily one of deliberate book burning, though that certainly occurred, but rather of institutional elimination, the removal of the structures that had made the preservation and study of classical texts possible. The broader cultural transformation that the Serapeum's destruction represented extended beyond Alexandria to affect the entire Mediterranean world. The elimination of major pagan centers of learning was part of a systematic effort to create a Christian intellectual culture that would replace the classical traditions that had dominated for nearly a millennium. This transformation was successful in that Christianity did become the foundation for medieval European civilization, but it came at the cost of much of the classical world's intellectual achievements. Modern scholars have debated whether the destruction of institutions like the Serapeum represented a necessary consequence of religious transformation or an unnecessary loss of valuable cultural resources. Some argue that the elimination of competing belief systems was essential for Christianity's development as a coherent worldview, while others view such destruction as an irreparable loss to human knowledge and cultural diversity. What is clear is that the transformation was complete and irreversible. The traditions of pagan learning that had been maintained in Alexandria could not survive the comprehensive replacement of their institutional foundations. The archaeological evidence for the destruction confirms both its thoroughness and its symbolic significance. Excavations at the site of the Serapeum have revealed evidence of systematic demolition, including the careful removal and burial of foundation stones, the distribution of decorative elements as spoils of victory, and the construction of Christian buildings directly on top of the destroyed pagan structures. These findings support the historical accounts of comprehensive destruction rather than mere abandonment or conversion. Now, the final elimination of Alexandrian scholarship was not accomplished through a single dramatic event, but through the cumulative effect of many actions over several decades. The destruction of the Serapeum was the most visible and symbolic of these actions, but it was preceded by the gradual elimination of other pagan institutions and followed by the persecution of individual scholars that made continued pagan intellectual activity impossible. Together, these actions created a transformation so complete that by the time of Hypatia's death in 415 CE, the tradition of Alexandrian scholarship that had flourished for nearly 7 centuries had effectively disappeared. What was lost in this transformation was not just a collection of books or a group of scholars, but an entire approach to knowledge that had characterized ancient civilization at its height. The Alexandrian model of systematic collection, critical analysis, and comprehensive scholarship created possibilities for human understanding that were not recovered in the Western world until the establishment of medieval universities many centuries later. The destruction of the institutions that supported such work represented the disappearance of a vision of learning that had been unique in human history. As you consider this final chapter in the Library of Alexandria's story, think about the ways that cultural transformations involve both creation and destruction. The emergence of Christianity as the dominant worldview in the ancient Mediterranean created new possibilities for human spiritual and intellectual development, but it also required the elimination of alternative approaches to understanding that had been developed over centuries. The story of the Serapeum and its destruction illustrates how these processes of cultural change occur, not just through gradual evolution, but through specific actions that eliminate existing possibilities while creating new ones. The complete story of the Library of Alexandria, from its ambitious founding as a universal repository of knowledge to its final disappearance through systematic destruction, spans nearly a millennium of human intellectual history. It demonstrates both the heights that human civilization can achieve when it dedicates significant resources to understanding the world and the vulnerability of even the greatest achievements to the changing political, religious, and cultural forces that shape human societies. Yet the tradition of rational inquiry that Alexandria represented did not disappear entirely with its physical institutions, continuing to influence human thought in ways that extend far beyond the physical remains of the ancient city. As you drift towards sleep, consider how this boring history, the patient accumulation of texts, the careful cataloguing of knowledge, the daily routines of scholars and scribes created the foundation for intellectual achievements that still shape human understanding today. The Library of Alexandria was not just a collection of scrolls, but a vision of what human knowledge could become when supported by adequate resources and sophisticated organization. The institution's slow decline, punctuated by periodic disasters, demonstrates that even the greatest intellectual achievements are vulnerable to the broader political and cultural forces that shape human societies. Yet the methods of systematic inquiry, critical analysis, and comprehensive scholarship developed in Alexandria survived the institution that created them, influencing subsequent developments in ways that continue to affect how we understand and organize knowledge. What makes this history particularly compelling for reflection is how it illustrates both the fragility and resilience of human intellectual endeavor. Physical institutions can be destroyed, individual scholars silenced, and comprehensive collections scattered to the winds. But the patterns of thinking and methods of investigation that characterize genuine scholarship have a way of surviving and re-emerging in new forms and new contexts. The next time you visit a library, use an online database or participate in any systematic attempt to preserve and organize human knowledge. You are participating in a tradition that extends back to the marble halls and papyrus scrolls of ancient Alexandria. The specific technologies and institutions have changed beyond recognition, but the underlying commitment to collecting, preserving, and sharing human understanding remains essentially the same. Perhaps the most important lesson from this history is that the advancement of knowledge requires sustained institutional support, systematic methodology, and a commitment to making information accessible to those who seek it. These elements are not automatic but must be deliberately created and carefully maintained. When they disappear, as they did in Alexandria, the loss extends far beyond the individual scholars and specific texts that are eliminated. The entire possibility of systematic understanding becomes endangered. Yet knowledge also has a way of surviving and re-emerging in new forms. The tradition of Alexandrian scholarship did not end with the destruction of the Serapeum or the murder of Hypatia. It transformed, adapted, and continued to influence human thought through different institutions and in different contexts. The comprehensive vision of human understanding that motivated the Mausion's founding remains part of our intellectual heritage, even as its specific embodiments have disappeared into the mists of time. As you prepare for sleep, let the patient accumulation of knowledge, the careful attention to detail, and the steady progress of understanding that characterized Alexandria's greatest centuries accompany your descent into rest. The boring history of daily scholarship, when multiplied across generations of dedicated workers, creates the foundation for breakthrough insights that transform human civilization. This process continues today in laboratories, libraries, and study rooms around the world as modern heirs to the Alexandrian tradition maintain and extend humanity's collective understanding of the universe we inhabit. The Library of Alexandria may be gone, but the dream of universal knowledge that inspired its creation remains alive in every serious attempt to understand our world more completely. That dream, like the knowledge it seeks to preserve and extend, has proven more durable than the institutions and individuals who serve it. As you sleep, may that continuity of human inquiry provide reassurance that patient, systematic effort, however boring it may appear to casual observation, creates the foundation for the intellectual breakthroughs that define human progress.